Hello, it's 10 o'clock on the 20th of September 2022. My name is Jonathan Greenstein and welcome to today's webinar, How Ready Are You for the FCA's New Consumer Duty Rules, presented by ComplyPort. It is important for me to tell you now that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording has started. In July 22, the FCA published its policy statement, PS 22.9, a new consumer duty, in which they introduced new rules to ensure financial services firms recognize the impact of their services and products and have on the consumer and provide a safeguard for exploitation. PS 22.9's publication brought with it a number of key dates that firms need to be aware of. The first and foremost of these is the end of October 22. It is by this date that firms' boards should have agreed their consumer duty implementation, delivery, and oversight plans. Firms need to be aware that adequate and robust implementation requires a tailored approach specific to the consumer needs of each firm. The needs of the consumer will be unique as the firm itself, and the implementation plans need to reflect this. Alongside this, they also need to consider the impact of their own business and their interactions with other regulated and non-regulated third parties within their implementation and delivery plan. During today's session, we will review PS 22.9, discuss the key deadlines from October 22 to July 24, consider what is required for the deadline in October, and assess how best to prepare the implementation and delivery plan. The session today will be delivered by an industry-leading expert, Simon Chapman, a director at ComplyPort. Simon is a compliance professional with more than 30 years experience within financial services, gained from working in a broad spectrum of financial services firms. He has been directly involved in regulatory compliance for over 25 years, both as a practitioner and a consultant, and has dealt with a wide range of financial services regulators. Simon is a specialist in culture, governance, and conduct issues, senior management controls, and enterprise-wide regulatory risk assessments. Additionally, he has led a number of specialist projects, including skilled persons reviews and conduct risk investigations. At ComplyPort, we are specialist regulatory compliance and financial crime consultants. Our team are expert in FCA authorization and registrations, having successfully assisted over 1,000 of these, day-to-day compliance, regulatory and financial crime support, and assisting firms in meeting the requirements of and implementing new regulations and laws. In addition to those services, ComplyPort also provides a RegTech solution to firms that supports them with the compliance monitoring and management of documentation and internal liaising required to sign off for financial promotions, skips and payments, etc. Now, before we begin promptly, I'd like to cover off some brief housekeeping points. Either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have it configured, you'll see a button called Q&A. If you have any questions, please ask them there, and we'll try and get through as many as we can today at the end of the session. Please do not post questions into the chat function, as this will not be monitored. Now, just before we begin and welcome Simon, we have 3 poll questions that we would like to ask. If you bear with me 2 seconds, I will launch them one by one now. So let's launch the first poll. The first poll is, can you say you are ready for the October deadline? 2 answers here, yes and no. And we'll give it a few moments for people to provide their answers, and then we will end the poll and share the results. I'm going to count down to about 10. I'll give it a few seconds. The answers are coming in fast and furiously at the moment. Over 100 and over 150 people responded. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, so let's end the poll and share the results. So I hope you can all see these here. Out of 159 people who have responded so far, 67% have said no, they are not ready for the October deadline yet, whereas 33% said yes, they are. So let's stop sharing this and launch the second poll. We'll try to be as quickly on these as we can. Second poll is, are you aware of all the requirements that PS 22-9 will bring to your firm? Again, 2 choices here, yes and no. And we'll wait for everyone to answer these. I'll give it another few moments. Again, answers are coming in very quickly. Seconds now, and we'll end the poll here and share the results. So again, the majority of people say they're not aware of all the requirements coming in, 60%, whereas 40% said yes, they are aware. And finally, the third poll. We'll launch it. Have you assessed how PS 22.9 will affect your financial promotions yet? Again, 3 answers, yes, no, and not applicable. So we'll give it a few moments. This is the final poll, and then we'll pass across to Simon. 2 more seconds here. And we will end the poll now so we can share the results. So again, overwhelmingly, people have said they're not aware of the effect, not assessed the effect that financial promotions will be impacted by a new consumer duty. 64% said no. So what we'll do, stop sharing here, and thank you to everyone who responded in these polls. With these answers now in mind, I would like to invite Simon to start today's discussion, please. Simon, over to you.
Thanks, Johnny. Good morning, everyone. I hope you've had a good summer break and are back full of enthusiasm and ready to get to grips with the new consumer duty. I always think the new consumer duty sounds a little bit like one of the episodes of Star Wars, but hopefully it's not quite as far-fetched as that. So, consumer duty, how did we get here? The new consumer duty has been in making for several years, and it's perhaps the most significant change to the regulation of the retail financial services market since the introduction of the Retail Distribution Review a decade ago. Over the years, the FCA has released a variety of discussion papers, guidance documents, etc., such as treating customers fairly, fair treatment of vulnerable customers, and so on. However, this has not resulted in the outcomes the FCA has desired. The new consumer duty has therefore been introduced to combat this and is more stringent than previous attempts to regulate this area of business. Will it be the final part of the jigsaw? Only time will tell. The likelihood is that the majority of firms will follow the rules and ensure the fair treatment of customers is at the heart of everything they do, much as they do now. But there will always be a minority who do not. And new scandals such as British Steel pension scheme and issues will always arise in the future, and the regulator will have to adapt going forward. For the time being, our focus is on consumer duty. So as you can see from the slide at the moment, we have a number of areas we'll be covering today. So looking at why the consumer duty has been proposed, what it is, what does it aim to achieve. We're looking at key dates, we're looking at how you can factor this into your implementation strategy and what you should be doing now. And at the end, as Johnny mentioned earlier, we'll have a session on any questions that you may have you want to raise as a consequence of today. So if we can maybe go on to the next slide, please, Johnny. So why has the new duty been introduced? We call it the new consumer duty, but it is the consumer duty, but it's not exactly the latest one, but we'll call it the consumer duty for the time being. As you can see from the slide, the FCA has found a number of unsatisfactory practices over the years, including unhelpful customer service that hinders consumers from taking quick action to control their financial affairs, services and products brought by consumers that are not reasonably priced, services and products that do not provide the expected benefits or the satisfaction of the customers, deceptive and complicated information that may be difficult to comprehend, and practices that exploit information asymmetries or hinder a consumer's ability to comply. As a result of these practices, consumers can endure harm in the form of being prohibited from accurately determining the value, characteristics, and benefits of a service or product, suffering monetary and non-monetary costs or disadvantages, receiving substandard treatment, purchasing services and products that are unsuitable for their needs or which might be too much of a risk or in any way damaging to them. The outcome of all of this has been that a new approach has been proposed, and this is now being implemented by the FCA, the new consumer duty. Next slide, please, Johnny. So what is the new consumer duty? So the FCA's proposals for consumer duty aim to strengthen the outcomes delivered for retail clients. The purpose is to enhance conduct standards in retail markets, drive cultural change, and instill customer trust. All sounds very familiar and very laudable. A new principle for business, Principle 12, will be introduced and will be supported by 3 cross-cutting rules with an objective of delivering 4 specific outcomes. And firms will have to achieve all of these and address all of these items when they are assessing how they comply with consumer duty. Next slide, please. So the consumer principle. The principles of business underpin the whole FCA handbook, and the FCA is revisiting this basic premise. Therefore, this is significant and needs to be taken seriously by all firms within scope. After many years of just 11 principles, the FCA is introducing a new principle for business. This is Principle 12, strangely. This principle states that a firm must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. This is the overarching high standard that firms in scope will now have to follow. This is different from Principle 6 and Principle 7 and goes beyond both existing principles. Principle 6 and 7 require firms to pay due regard to the interests of customers and to treat them fairly, and to communicate in a way that is clear, fair, and not misleading, respectively. However, the new principle, Principle 12, requires firms to act to deliver good outcomes, the emphasis being on the word act compared to pay due regard. Firms will also be expected to evidence and assess how they are acting to deliver good outcomes for retail customers throughout the business lifecycle. An item will have to be addressed on an ongoing basis on at least an annual basis. Principle 12 signals a change in approach from a more reactive approach to a proactive expectation from the regulator. Where the consumer duty applies, so where firms have retail customers or retail customers in the chain, things will change. Principle 6 and 7 are disapplied and new Principle 12 applies. However, where the consumer duty does not apply, Principle 6 and 7 will continue to apply. So in that instance, there's no particular change. Firms need to know which principle they are dealing with. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier the cross-cutting rules. The 3 cross-cutting rules develop the FCA's overarching expectations for common themes that apply across all areas of conduct. Firms will have to act in good faith to avoid foreseeable harm and to help retail customers reach their financial objectives. The terms good faith and foreseeable harm are very interpretive, as you can imagine. Firms must define what these mean to them and communicate it to the regulator when requested to do so, and also across the firm in a consistent and regular manner. The pursuing financial objectives rule is different from the previous approach to conduct regulation, which was, if we don't advise customers, then customers can make their own decision, a sort of caveat emptor. Now, firms will have to equip customers to make the sensible decision, and you will need to show that you have done everything reasonable to achieve this. This clearly puts a responsibility onto the firm and is a further step away from caveat emptor. Next slide, please. In addition to the new principle for firms, Principle 12, the FCA is also introducing a new individual conduct rule. This is Conduct Rule 6, and states that individuals must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. The new conduct rule is similar to the cross-cutting rules in that staff must act in good faith towards customers, by which the FCA means a standard of conduct characterized by honesty, fair and open dealing, and acting consistently with the reasonable expectations of retail customers. The rule must also avoid foreseeable harm to customers, and staff must enable and support customers to pursue their financial objectives and goals. So not only can the firm be held accountable for failings of outcomes for retail customers under the Principle 12, but individual staff members can also be held accountable under Conduct Rule 6. Next slide. The consumer duty sees a shift from a rules-based regulatory approach to one based on outcomes. The first outcome relates to products and services. These must be designed to meet the needs of consumers and sold to those whose needs they meet. Price and value is the second outcome, and firms must ensure that the price of products represent a fair value. In the future, we may see the FCA even setting prices for certain products and services in certain sectors. Consumer understanding is the third outcome. The FCA wants communications with retail consumers to be sufficiently clear and relevant so as to enable them to make informed decisions. This can only happen if consumers are given the information they need at the right time and presented in a way that they can understand. The final outcome is consumer support. The FCA wants firms to provide a level of support that meets consumers' needs, including those of vulnerable customers, throughout the relationship with the firm. This means customer service should enable customers to realize the benefits of their products and services and support them in pursuing their financial objectives. Firms must comply with all 4 outcomes and rules, not just 1 or 2, and they are all significant in their own right. I'll explain later how firms can meet these objectives. Next slide, please. A key element is actually identifying whether or not you're actually in scope. So who is actually in scope of the new consumer duty? Unfortunately, it's not black and white. I think that most firms now recognize that by simply not having retail clients does not of itself mean that the firm is out of scope. The new consumer duty applies to all firms who have retail clients and all firms engaging in regulated activities across the retail distribution chain. The duty applies across the distribution chain from product and service origination through to distribution and post-sale activities. By the distribution chain, we mean all firms involved in the manufacture, provision, sale and ongoing administration and management of a product or service to the end retail customer. The duty applies to firms that can determine or materially influence retail consumer outcomes. For example, it applies to firms that can influence material aspects of or determine the design or operation of retail products or services, including their price and value, the distribution of retail products or services, the preparation and approval of communications that are to be issued to retail customers, so financial promotions, or engaging in customer support for retail customers. The FCA would generally expect firms with a decision-making role for one or more of the 4 customer outcomes to have the greatest responsibility under the duty. The duty applies proportionately based on what is reasonable in the circumstances, 2 of the FCA's favourite words, proportionate and reasonable. The extent of a firm's responsibilities will depend on its role and the extent of a firm's influence over retail customer outcomes. The level of responsibility depends on a firm's actual role and influence, rather than just what is set out in contractual terms between the firms in the chain. Firms will need to look at how a retail customer is defined in the relevant code of conduct sourcebooks. A retail customer is not defined in the same way. For example, in COBS, they are all retail clients, i.e. a client who is not a professional client. In ICOBS, it's all policyholders. The duty does not apply to reinsurance contracts of large risk sold to commercial customers or other contracts of large risk where the risk is located outside the UK. Nor does it apply to activities connected to the distribution of group insurance policies or the extension of these policies to new members. In BCOPS, all banking customers are caught, including both consumers and micro enterprises. And for UK UCITS, AIFs, and collective investment scheme operators, it covers a person who is a unit holder, an investor in an AIF, or the beneficial owner of shares or units in a fund, except for professional investors. So as you can see, it covers a wide range of participants and different types of people. The duty extends to SMEs, to payment services, retail lending, deposit taking, insurance, investment, and mortgage-related business. It applies to firms conducting regulated business in the UK, including Gibraltar firms selling into the UK and firms in the FCA's transition period post-Brexit. And it also applies to firms that purchase a book or service, a product or service book. Next slide, please. So the key dates. We're probably all familiar with, and Johnny has mentioned at the top of the webinar, a number of these key dates, but just to run through them. The rules are due to come into full effect on 31st of July next year, but there are important dates in the implementation period to be identified. Notably, by the end of October this year, firms' management bodies should have agreed their implementation plans and be able to evidence that they have challenged the plans to ensure they are deliverable to meet the new standards. So it's it's sufficient just to have a plan in place. Boards have got to be able to demonstrate they've challenged and identified the issues with it. Firms should expect to be asked to share implementation plans, board papers and minutes with supervisors and be challenged on their contents. Manufacturers should aim to complete all of the reviews necessary to meet the 4 outcome rules by the end of April 2023, so that they can share information with distributors and identify where changes need to be made to their existing products and services to meet the duty. It is clearly important for firms that are distributors to have relevant information available from manufacturers in good time before the rules come into full force. Without this information, it may not be possible, or at least it will be difficult, for firms to establish and demonstrate that products and services meet the needs of their clients. This must be done by the end of July 2023, and on 31st of July, the new rules come into force for existing products and services that are open to sale or renewal. The effective date is July 2024 for closed products and services, that is, those products and services that are no longer available as renewal or new business to customers. Embedding the duty will be a complex task. The FCA expects firms to make full use of the implementation period to embed the duty across their businesses. Firms will need to ensure their implementation plans are robust, and firms' management bodies will need to maintain oversight of the plans and work to implement them. It is important to note that whilst the majority of firms have until next July to finalise their plans, firms applying for authorisation or those applying to vary permissions have to comply with the consumer duty now. They must demonstrate this in their business plan and be able to explain and reference how they meet the consumer duty. This may influence the timing of any submission of variation applications. Next slide, please. So what should firms be doing? Products and services. It's important to note that the duty does not have a retrospective effect and does not apply to past actions by firms. Actions taken before the duty comes into force are subject to the rules that applied at the time. Firms are often worried that the FOS can be a law unto itself and in these sorts of matters, but the Ombudsman has indicated that it will not apply retrospective standards. However, the duty does apply on a forward-looking basis to existing products and services. These are products and services still on sale to new customers or available for renewal by existing customers. And to closed book products and services, these are products and services that are no longer on sale to new customers or available for renewal by existing customers. So it covers both areas. Looking at review of existing products and services, you will need to comply with the duty in full for existing products and services. You must review products and services against all aspects of the duty before the end of the implementation period and on an ongoing basis. If firms identify issues with an existing product or service, these need to be addressed before they can be sold to new customers. This might mean a firm needs to take action, including updating the contractual terms and conditions of a product or service before it can be sold to new customers. The duty also applies in full to closed products and services. However, these products and services outcomes does not apply in the same way as for new or existing products or services. For example, as there will be no further sales, there is no requirement for firms to have a target market or distribution strategy for the product or service. Of course, issues such as customer vulnerability must be considered at each stage, and firms will need robust, vulnerable customer policies and procedures in order to ensure compliance with this aspect of the duty. You will need to demonstrate that the value of products and services is reasonable to the price charged and evidence this through a price assessment. The assessment should take place at the design stage, but also as an ongoing process. Given the experience we have had with things like the RDR over a decade ago, we believe that the outcome for price and value is likely to be the most difficult to achieve, as it's up to individual firms to identify how they value their particular products, how they value their particular services. For consumer understanding, the FCA wants communications with retail consumers to enable the consumer to make informed decisions. This can only happen if consumers are given the information they need at the right time and presented in a way that they can understand. This includes both before the purchase of a product and at suitable points throughout the life cycle of the product. Therefore, understanding your customers is a critical element of getting this right. The FCA wants firms to provide a level of support that meets consumers' needs throughout their relationship with the firm, and in particular, vulnerable customers. This means customer service should enable consumers to realize the benefits of their products and services and support them in pursuing their financial objectives. Where vulnerabilities are identified, appropriate support must be provided to enable this aim to be achieved. Next slide, please. Looking at governance, the duty should be reflected in firm strategies, governance, leadership, and people policies, including incentives at all levels. Senior managers will be held accountable for delivering good customer outcomes within their area of responsibility, in line with the SMCR duty of responsibility and the conduct rules. The importance of accountability is emphasised by the fact that the FCA will consider evidence of individuals' understanding of and actions taken to comply with the duty when considering individuals for approval for senior management roles. Firms should also have a duty champion at board or equivalent level, who, along with the chair and/or CEO, ensures that the duty is discussed regularly and is raised in all relevant discussions. As noted earlier, the new Conduct Rule 6, which is you must act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers, will be applied to all relevant staff members. The individual conduct rules in the Code of Conduct Sourcebook, COCON, sets minimum standards of individual behaviour in financial services and apply to all employees in a firm except for ancillary staff. Individual Conduct Rule 6 reflects the new higher standard of the duty and the behaviour the FCA expects of conduct staff. It requires all conduct rule staff to act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers where the activities of the firm fall within the scope of the duty. At least annually, your board or equivalent governing body should review and approve an assessment of whether the firm is delivering good outcomes for its customers, which are consistent with the duty. This assessment should include the results of the monitoring that the firm has undertaken to assess whether products and services are delivering expected outcomes in line with the duty, any evidence of poor outcomes, including whether any group of customers is receiving worse outcomes compared to other groups, and an evaluation of the impact and the root cause. It will also include an overview of the actions taken to address any risks or issues identified, and how the firm's future business strategy is consistent with acting to deliver good outcomes under the duty. As I said earlier, this is an item which not only needs to be addressed now and over the next 9 months, but is an ongoing and will be expected to be an ongoing part of business as usual for all firms. This assessment will be part of the evidence the FCA uses to assess a firm's compliance with the duty. It will expect to be provided on request with the report and the management information that sits behind it. So the key takeaway there is not only have you got to do the report, but you need to have the information that underpins the report. So therefore demonstrating that you have actually looked at it and not just essentially signed off from the previous year. Next slide, please. So what should firms be doing now? The consumer duty will impact the entire business life cycle, from product and service development and pricing through to the way a firm communicates with its clients and provides ongoing support services. Firms should conduct a holistic examination of how the new rules will translate into their business model. You need to be honest about what aspects of the new standards you need to work on, or perhaps hadn't previously considered in much depth. You need to review existing communications, including your website, promotional assets, and any social media content, to ensure that they meet the clear, fair, and not misleading standards. One way of achieving this, and one that we have long espoused for ensuring compliance with the financial promotion rules, is putting yourself in the customer's shoes by perhaps utilising members of your team who are not involved in the technicalities of compliance on a day-to-day basis. If they understand it, then it stands a good chance of being understood by your target clients. If you outsource key activities, you need to consider if these third parties interact with retail customers and adapt this. So you need to meet the consumer's needs. As with most things in compliance world, it is vital to document the decision-making process. This will be useful in evidencing your thinking in areas where you believe your existing controls and processes already meet the consumer duty requirements. It is also crucial to delegate responsibility for different aspects of the duty to the relevant staff members. Your gap analysis will drive your implementation plan and is the key element in preparations for the October deadline. You will need to be clear about what research you will need to conduct to confirm your products and services are appropriate for your target market, and evidence this. You will want to review how you measure up against the duty's 4 outcomes and what adjustments are required to fill any gaps. You should consider your terms and conditions, complaints procedures, product benefits and financial promotions, factoring in the behavioural tendencies and vulnerabilities of a potentially diverse consumer base. How is your customer policy stacking up? Have you reviewed it recently? The skills possessed by your staff is often the one subject that is overlooked. It is all well and good having appropriate policies and procedures, documented sales processes, and a super client communication process. But if you don't have the right staff to follow these through, then you may be in trouble. Knowledge assessments will need to be carried out as part of the gap analysis, and appropriate training will be a critical element of the post-October implementation process, and one not to be overlooked. It is evidence that firms will need to make sure they have the right tools and processes in place to efficiently monitor outcomes and respond to concerns. For example, complaint analysis, product choice data, advice file review trends, client research data, product performance statistics, client reviews and contacts, and so on. These will serve as a basis for board assurance or evidence of where action needs to be taken. So the message is clear. 31st of October is fast approaching, and you need to identify gaps in your current processes. Draft, challenge, and redraft your implementation plan. Ensure the plan is reviewed and implemented by the end of next July. Hopefully this presentation will have clarified the next or even the first steps of some of you, and given those who have already started food for thought to ensure that your plans are robust. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your attendance. That completes the formal presentation, and I'll hand you back to my colleague for any questions.
Thanks, Simon. Incredibly detailed presentation, and I'm sure our audience found it invaluable. This now concludes the formal presentation section of the webinar, and I've seen questions coming in fast and furiously, but I'm going to again remind people that the Q&A section is in the tab either at the top or bottom of your screen is where you can ask questions. We've got about 5 or 6 at the moment, but we'll give a few minutes for more to come in. And whilst we do that, I'm just going to come back to that slide in a second. I'd like to let everyone know on this webinar that Comply Port, we can assist firms with meeting the requirements and deadlines imposed by PS 22.9. We've launched a number of services to help you review and prepare for the new regulatory developments. On the screen here, you can see an example of our readiness assessment tool that is available for firms to use now. And if you'd like to use, please contact either Simon or myself on the email addresses below. We can arrange for a demonstration of how this looks. Additionally, we are offering a free consultancy meeting to those who are watching this webinar to discuss consumer duty and vulnerable customer management. If you want to book one of these meetings, again, email addresses are at the bottom of the screen. So please, can you email me with preferred date and times for this conversation? So let's go back to my questions page here and start going through some of the questions. Bear with me. So the first question we have here is, we are an FCA regulated firm based in the UK. We have a few elected professional clients based in the UK, EU, and the rest of the world, all trade execution only. Does the consumer duty apply to all those clients? We also have other regulated brokers as clients. We have no material impact on the brokers or their underlying clients. Does consumer duty apply to those brokers based mostly overseas? Simon, what are your views?
Okay, thank you for that question. Fundamentally, this is a UK-based piece of legislation and rules, and applies only to retail customers. So if you have elective professional clients and you're confident that they meet the right requirements and that they're not actually within scope. Equally, because it won't apply to the overseas brokers because they're not doing business in the UK, but it will apply to any UK-based firm dealing with ultimately retail customers.
Thank you, Simon. So hopefully, because you've just mentioned this applies only to firms' retail customers. The next one may be quick and easy to answer. We're a corporate finance firm with only deal with institutional investors. We've thought about things and are cognizant in the direction of travel, but do not believe that we have to do anything specific. The RDR was not applicable to us also. We do, however, think about TCF and may mention the new consumer duty in the compliance manual, but believe we have nothing more to do than that. Is this correct?
Okay, having looked at the question, we only ever give honest answers, just so you know. I think the point here is, it looks like you have actually looked into the whole point is whether or not the firm is in scope. It looks very much as though you've looked at that in great deal of depth. And as we sort of say, it is all down to whether or not you have a material impact on various aspects of the customer journey, and ultimately whether or not there's, at the end of the day, there is actually a retail customer involved. If you are only dealing with institutional investors and there's no element of retail, then absolutely I think that you have done what you need to do. I don't see it as an issue being the question. So I think, yeah, that would, to my mind, would suggest you've actually done a good job. It's good to see you're thinking about TCF. I think all firms need to do that, whether or not, you should all be treating customers fairly anyway, whatever type of customer they happen to be. And I think just keeping an eye on this on an ongoing basis, because as we sort of say, the whole point of the duty is something that needs to be looked at on an ongoing basis. It's not a one-time approach. It is becomes business as usual. So as part of your regular business reviews, consider whether or not you fall within scope, because obviously circumstances change, and whilst you may be out of scope now, you may be within scope next year or the year after. So keep an eye on that. But I think so far it looks like you've done what you need to do.
Very much. Next question. How do we define foreseeable harm? We have intolerable harm contained within operational resilience and material outsourcing from the FCA. Are they now pushing towards a continuum of harm? And is that then defined?
Good question. Like a lot of things the FCA comes out with, proportionate, reasonable, etc. It is very much down to how firms interpret it. It is very, we have had intolerable harm from operational resilience, and clearly that is probably a slightly more defined term than foreseeable harm. I mean, foreseeable harm just basically talks about harm. Is the customer going to be harmed, and is it reasonable that you could have foreseen that would have happened? To a large degree, I don't want to say this will be regulation or enforcement by hindsight, but there's inevitably going to be an element of that coming into play. But you need to be able to. So the only way to counteract that is to actually look and read identify everything that could possibly go wrong for your customers, and ensure that your policies and processes are such that any products and services address those potential issues. Things like, obviously a foreseeable harm about losing materially losing out. The obvious thing there is actually losing investment monies, etc., etc. You can't legislate for markets per se, but you can legislate for people being in, or investors being in, the wrong level of risk investment. So those sorts of things I think you can look for. So I think harm will always be there, because it's one of the FCA's sort of underpinning reasons for existing, is ensuring that that customers are protected as much as possible. So I think you'll find that this is something that will crop up time and time again.
Thank you. Does the new consumer duty apply to regulated claims management firms?
Great question, and one I'll have to get back to you on.
Okay, perfect. Now, you talked about manufacturers earlier. What is the definition of manufacturers? Does it apply to MPS? For instance, the person who asked this question said they run discretionary mandates in-house using ETFs only.
The product, to a degree, that is almost a manufacturer of a service. Yes, I would suggest that is caught. Whilst the service, the MPS actually relies on other products, you are pulling that together as a package, in which case I'll classify that as a manufacturer.
Great. So does consumer duty have to be added to another responsibility under the senior manager's statement of responsibilities?
Yes, basically it's not a prescribed responsibility, well, not yet anyway, but basically it would come under, if you have one person is responsible for the whole of consumer duty, then yes, it should be under their other responsibilities. Otherwise, if it is split, as we did mention, that it's important that aspects of the consumer duty assessment is delegated to the right people. You may find that particular elements of the of consumer duty maybe have responsibility elsewhere, but my gut feel, if you like, and if he hasn't been particularly verbose on this, my gut feel is that there will be one person within the business who's responsible overall for this consumer duty, and that ought to be added to their other responsibilities on their SORs.
How will the new Conduct Rule 6 differ from Principle 12?
To all intents and purposes, it won't. I mean, I wouldn't try looking for differences. I would simply say that they apply the same way. It's just that one's for individuals, one is for the business itself.
So in respect of price and value, how can we demonstrate that this is of value when we do not have any influence on the price being charged, as this is set by the insurer?
Well, if you have no influence, this is one of the key elements of the assessment, is actually, do you have material influence over certain aspects of the business of the products and service? If you have no influence over the price, then that's something you can't do anything about. If you're charging, however, for a review service, and that's another matter, you can set your charges to make sure that they're reasonable and reflect the value of the service. If you are part of an insurance distribution chain, for example, you actually have the ability to set price potentially, because you can always add on your additional charges and fees, and then in which case you would be caught. But if you have no way of influencing price, then that particular element can probably be omitted.
So for product design and review, is the Prod 4 assessment we have already done sufficient, or does it need to go one step further than this?
Good question. You need to, but basically bear in mind that the consumer duty is not an amalgam, but basically takes different parts and different elements of regulation. So you've got TCF, you've got vulnerable customers, you've got the prod rules. If you have done a product design review, it is going to be very close to what's required under the consumer duty. I would just be inclined to double check that, make sure that all aspects of consumer duty, and bear in mind the FCA has a history of not being particularly joined up on these sorts of things. I would be inclined to make sure that every element that you've considered as part of your Prod 4 assessment is covered by what the FCA expects under a consumer duty assessment.
Now, does the consumer duty apply to the appointed reps that a firm has?
It applies to all firms, but the principal firm will be responsible for this. So they need to be taking notes. The principal firm will need to be taking note of all distribution channels and clients and customers and so on and so forth. And whether or not that review is then delegated down to the appointed representative, albeit with appropriate oversight as part of the gap analysis, is down to the firm itself. But no, it certainly will apply to all firms in the UK undertaking in scope business with appropriate client types.
In the mortgage market, for brokers, surely this is a sledgehammer to crack a nut that doesn't exist? Question mark.
I am no apologist for the FCA, and equally, we sit very much sort of on the fence with this, in the sense of, we're not Comply Board is not a regulated firm as such, and we're not a regulator. We're there to try and help firms understand what the regulator actually requires. To a certain degree, you can take the view that is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and it may or may not exist. But actually, in a mortgage market, you may be offering services around product review, etc. You can't. Back on the previous question, you can't affect price per se on the product itself, which is fine. So that part of the assessment is sort of not relevant. But you do actually have other aspects. You do charge fees for services. You need to make sure that actually those fees are reasonable for your clients. Whether it's sledgehammer to crack a non-existent nut, I think that's something that I probably am not best positioned to comment on. But I think we all have different views on that.
So could you say more about testing and evidencing of good outcomes, particularly in the context of a consumer lending business? The person asked this question has said, we are starting to consider the types of evidence we should seek and collate, but would welcome your ideas and suggestions to ensure we don't overlook anything.
Okay, I mean, I think that question is probably something that can't really be answered very quickly on this sort of forum, I don't believe. The whole point about testing and evidencing outcomes, you need to be thinking about whether or not a customer is making informed choices. So is the your communication channels, are they clear, fair, not misleading? Is all the right information clearly defined? As I mentioned before, a lot of the consumer duty elements are all they draw from other parts of the FCA's guidance and source books and so on and so forth. So under the financial promotion rules, you have an obligation for consumer lending to ensure that the right level of information is provided. You need to ensure that from your perspective, the testing and evidencing and outcomes is demonstrating that customers are taking the right product for themselves. They're not getting into ultimate difficulties in repaying those loans. Information which you can get from lenders. You ensure that the loan is taken out by the right person for the right purpose. So there are ways and means that can be done. I think it's something that's probably takes a little bit longer than a relatively brief webinar to run through, unfortunately.
Okay. How does the new consumer duty impact one-man band and small firms? What depth of paperwork will they require?
Great question. It talks a lot about boards and challenge, etc., etc. I fully accept in a one-man band, you're not going to challenge yourself to a certain degree. I think what you have got there is the age-old question of how do I evidence that that I'm doing the right thing when it's just me doing it. The evidence of the paperwork, I would suggest you need to again, there's no difference in the gap analysis. You need to essentially do your gap analysis, understand where potential weaknesses are, fill those weaknesses, albeit that may entail some sort of training for yourself, and may entail just some sort of changes to policies and processes. In terms of how you evidence what the challenge of that, clearly you can't challenge yourself, but what you can do is you can actually, and this is no particular plug for compliance, compliance consultants in general, or ComplyPort in particular, but having your plans reviewed by a third party, whether that be someone that you know and trust, and not a member of the sort of your investment, maybe sort of your party to a group of similarly minded individuals, whether you have industry bodies you can actually use, or whether you have a compliance consultant you can actually ask for their opinion. But they will give you, ask for other people's opinion. I would suggest that's probably quite a good idea.
So the FCA says there is not an oversight requirement between regulated entities. Yet again, there is a requirement to ask for information along the distribution chain and raise concerns with firms and notify the FCA where appropriate. Is there ultimately an oversight requirement?
I'm not sure what the question really is getting at, but if you say ultimate oversight requirement of the overall product chain, so potentially from the manufacturer downwards, if that's what the question is there's no ultimate oversight requirement as such. The manufacturers have more responsibilities because they are producing a product, and whether that's a manufacturer of a product or a service, it makes a difference. They have responsibility for identifying all the costs of the service and ultimately the target market for whom it's required, and then to distribute that information or make that information available to the distribution chain. So I think if you like, there is a sort of pseudo oversight requirement at the top end, but there's no obligation, to my knowledge, and I'm there to be corrected, no obligation to my knowledge for participants in a chain to then be subject to oversight by the manufacturer. However, I am very much aware in areas such as insurance distribution that if you have the ultimate insurer who then grants a responsibility or permission for underlying brokers to actually to sell that product, then they may actually withdraw that opportunity, that service, if they feel that appropriate standards aren't being met. So the potentially in that area there is, but in the more sort of general investment market, I don't think there is an ultimate responsibility.
Next question. We are a UK regulated firm that fully owns a DFM. Do both businesses have to develop consumer duty policy and procedures? Or can the regulated advice business set the policies and procedures for both?
On the assumption that they are, and from the turn of the phrase you already use, yes, they are two separately regulated businesses. Each regulated business has to actually undertake, has to have their own assessment. Now, whether or not that's done collectively and then it's split out into the advisory and the manufacturing side, DFM side, it comes down to, I think, individual choices. I mean, it would make sense, I think, potentially to actually review them together. That will enable, perhaps you can actually sort of gain benefits of scale in that sense, and not do the same thing twice in certain areas. But there will need to be an assessment done in respect of the manufacturer and an assessment done in respect of the advice.
So another question here. We're really starting to receive questions about compliance with the consumer duty as part of third-party due diligence. Could you say more about the ensuring good outcomes at all stages of the distribution chain and the types of questions we should be asking each other, both at this time and once the consumer duty is in force?
Okay, good question again. I think where you have, I think the questions to ask are basically the questions you should be asking yourself. If you have got a third party and you're doing due diligence on them, you need to understand that they understand that what they're doing, and they understand who the customers are, they understand what the ultimate sort of risks and harms, potential risks and harms are. Find out what it is that they're actually doing about it. Check for their own gap analysis. If that's you'll be doing a gap analysis and having an output in terms of the issues that have been identified. If you are if you're using a third party, it's reasonable for you to actually take a similar approach and ask what they've been doing. Because if they have, if you're dealing with a third party and relying on them to undertake a particular activity, and actually they're not going to be performing that activity, then you have to ask yourself the question whether you should be dealing with them.
Thank you. Are non-UK SME companies borrowing in the UK for property / buy-to-let caught under consumer duty?
Okay. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I mean, as we sort of say, the scope of this is if you are undertaking regulated activity in the UK and you have ultimately a retail customer, then actually you're caught. I would have to look. The nature of that question could be quite complex. I don't know the answer. We can potentially get back to you on that.
For any questions like this to our audience, what we'll do is we will contact the person who asked it individually to arrange for a meeting to discuss it in more detail. We've got time for a few more questions before we have to close off today's session. Let's just go through as many as we can here. Would the new consumer duty rules apply to us if our per se professional independent overseas brokers had retail clients, but not us?
It all comes down to, are you doing regulated business in the UK, and are those ultimately, do you have retail customers in the product chain? So ultimately, do they end up as individuals or otherwise defined as retail clients? If the answer is yes, then actually yes, the rules will apply to you. It may actually apply, to a lesser degree. As we sort of say, it's proportionate and reasonable, the good FCA buzz phrases. The fact that there's actually an overseas element in the chain sort of doesn't really stop the consumer duty applying. Is you have to consider if you're in the UK, you're caught by the UK rules.
Thank you. Can you help firms with setting up outcomes testing and evidence frameworks, for example, software system, balance scorecards, etc.? I think it's a question to us, really.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, we can help without being too sort of glib about it. Yes, I mean we are setting ourselves up to assist firms, or have set ourselves up to assist firms to undertake these assessments. And I'm sure Johnny will provide some information if necessary.
Now, thank you very much, Simon. We've had a few more questions, but I'm conscious of time here today. So for everyone whose questions we've not been able to answer, we will contact them individually. We've had a couple of people ask about slides. So yes, the recording of this webinar, and to mention this webinar has been recorded, will be made available and sent round to everyone. We will not be sending the slides through as a presentation, only the recording. So I'd like to thank everyone on today's session for joining us for this interesting discussion. As mentioned a second ago, the recording will be online soon, and please can you follow ComplyPort on LinkedIn to see when this becomes available to watch. We will also be sending it out by email. To everyone and to you, Simon, thank you very much and have a very good day.